protecting customers from fraud and scams is good for business. We're excited to have you all join us for this conversation, highlighting some of the research found in our latest white paper, Fraud Prevention Education, A Positive Customer Experience, which was released in partnership with Javelin Strategy and Research. We're thrilled to have a panel of expert thought leaders from around the industry who will share insights around how the pandemic altered the fraud landscape, how consumer education is key to curbing identity fraud, and resources and tools businesses can put in place to help their customers avoid data compromise and much more. I'm Paige Schaefer, and I'm the moderator for today's event. I'm proud to be the CEO of Iris Global Identity and Cyber Protection, powered by Generali, a trusted identity and cyber protection partner to many financial institutions, insurance carriers, and cyber security providers. We provide technology-focused and people-first identity and cyber protection services that are customized to fit a company's brand, creating a seamless experience that also meets the end customer's needs. As I'm sure you are aware, this month is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we're proud to be Cybersecurity Awareness Month champions and have educational resources on our website, including weekly blogs, an interactive quiz, and more to help you practice secure and safe identity and cyber habits. Please visit irisidentityprotection.com for more information. So before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Questions are welcome, so please type them in the question box when you have one for our panel. We'll answer the questions at the end of each speaker's presentation, as well as at the end of the webinar. If you have additional questions after the webinar, we'll have our contact information shown on the screen at the end of today's session. Finally, this webinar will be recorded, so don't feel the need to take fast and furious notes. A link to the recording will be emailed to all participants tomorrow. Okay, so now that we have our housekeeping items out of the way, let me introduce you to today's panelists. We have Tracy Kitten, who is the Director of Fraud and Security with Javelin Strategy and Research. Welcome, Tracy. Next up is Greg Saunders, who is the Senior Vice President of Security and Cyber Innovation with MasterCard. Welcome, Greg. And last but not least is Arturo Perez Reyes, who is the Cyber and Technology Leader and Senior Vice President with Hub International Limited. So without further ado, Tracy, take it away.
Great, thanks, Paige. And if we could go ahead and just move to the next slide, please. And before I jump into this slide and kind of delve into some of the things noted here, I just want to kind of echo some of what Paige said. So, you know, fraud and the cyber state of the union, as it were, has forever changed. The pandemic changed the fraud landscape, and we won't see that go back. Employees working from home, consumers in isolation, children learning remotely, all of these things had an impact on our society, and it wasn't just local. This was a global impact that we saw, which we all know. And of course, the criminals quickly adjusted the tactics that they used, and they changed the way they targeted consumers and some of the channels that they exploited. So for one, you know, as more consumers relied more heavily on digital channels, we quickly saw that there were weaknesses that cyber criminals were able to exploit. Things like weak authentication or verification, even weak endpoint security, really kind of created this fertile ground for cybersecurity issues, as well as the perpetration of fraud. Part of that fueled what we call the explosion of scams. So scams would be, you know, places where cyber criminals could target consumers directly, trigger consumers to take some kind of action that would result in fraudulent activity. Now, scams, of course, saw a significant uptick in the wake of the pandemic. Scams have been around for a long time. If you think about these kind of in-person scams where someone knocks on the door and says they're here to perform some kind of handyman or handy person service, that's been around for a long time, but we just saw that explode during the pandemic and, of course, after we came out of isolation. And those things are not going to go away. Some other things that aren't going to change is, you know, the workforce model has forever changed. We aren't just going to see remote employees disappear. As we all know, many of us are still working from home, myself included, and so that's not going to change. Remote learning is still going to be an option, even though it may be somewhat of a hybrid model. We do see that educational systems and universities are continuing to offer students remote options. So one of the things that we have to think about when we think about, you know, this arena of scams is that we have to think about the fact that because we have this new environment, consumers have a lot more ways to fall victim to scams. And I'll delve into this a little bit more deeply in just a few minutes when we move to this particular slide. But we really have to pay attention to how we educate consumers about scams. So the way criminals are targeting consumers varies very much so on how old that consumer is, because we see generational differences in the types of channels consumers use and the way that they're going to fall for a scam. And criminals have gotten very, very good at doing that. So Paige, I'll delve into that a little bit more in a few minutes. So let's look at the slide at hand here. I think one of the things worth noting here is that non-financial data in many cases is just as valuable to criminals as financial data. In some cases, it's even more valuable. And this kind of predated the pandemic, though the pandemic likely accelerated or kind of fueled this change. I think a big piece of this is that if we look at things like email addresses and passwords, you can see here that they fall only second to credit card numbers, which of course, credit card numbers, are obviously attractive. That's financial information. But I think the fact that email addresses and passwords, as well as physical addresses, are even more of interest and value to cyber criminals is definitely worth noting. From a consumer perspective, and I'd be curious to hear what the other panelists here have to say about this, I think consumers are still not really quite clear as to how valuable email addresses or even physical addresses are on the dark web. I think, oftentimes we see consumers more concerned about protecting social security numbers. Personally, I don't really even worry about that so much anymore because I know my social is out there on the dark web and probably has been for a long time. The reason we see things like email addresses being valuable is you think about the average consumer, an email address is linked to many different accounts, and oftentimes it's the same email address. So once a cyber criminal is able to compromise one email address and a password, they have the proverbial keys to the kingdom. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of highlights what I was talking about earlier, how we see generational differences in the types of scams that consumers fall for. So let's look at the silent generation as an example, and this would be consumers aged 76 and older. They're much more likely than other generations to fall for the phone call scams. They're also more likely to fall for those scams I was talking about earlier that involve kind of that in-person, face-to-face contact. But you can see that if we look at some of the younger generations, so Gen X, and millennials, they're much more likely to fall for scams that involve some kind of targeting through social media, right? And they're much more likely to fall for those scams than some of the older generations are. Let's move to the next slide, please, but keep this slide in mind as I point out something that I think is relevant and noteworthy. So I think we oftentimes make the assumption that older generations are less savvy, they're probably more likely to fall for a scam. But in actuality, it's younger generations that are more likely to be victimized by scams and suffer financial losses, which, is unfortunate because they don't have, as many financial assets typically. It's going to have longer lasting effects on them. And let's face it, these are the consumers that are going to have financial services. They're going to be working with businesses longer. So the more we can do to help them prevent fraud and prevent losses, the better off it's going to be long term for customer satisfaction and for attrition. I think there are a couple of things worth noting here that relate to younger consumers and why they're more likely to fall victim to scams. I think they have riskier behaviors. They obviously use more digital channels. And as I mentioned earlier, digital channels are just more prevalent now. They're more likely to share personal information on social media platforms. They're more likely to use multiple social media platforms. And they're more likely to accept friend requests, for instance, from individuals that they may not know. We don't see this type of behavior in older generations. And so I think when we take a step back and we kind of erase our assumptions about the generations that fall victim, it makes sense. Next slide, please. And so we can see here, as I was talking about, how important it is from a customer attrition standpoint, and I could say member attrition as well. Fraud has a direct impact on the relationship that a consumer has with a financial institution. And because we look at financial services more specifically than other industries, this is kind of where we surveyed consumers. But you can see here that 61% of the consumers who said that they suffered some kind of significant or very significant impact because of fraud were much more likely to leave their primary financial institution 12 months within the fraudulent event than those consumers who said they either didn't suffer any kind of fraud or they weren't significantly impacted. I think this bodes well for empowerment of consumers to implement some of these consumer educational programs and platforms, because the more we get consumers involved in helping to not only detect scams, but also report them, and other fraudulent activity for that matter, the more we're going to reduce fraud. And it's also going to help in the resolution process. And I think we can talk about this a little bit later as some of the other panelists bring in their perspective. But that whole education and empowerment and collaborative relationship that you can have with your customers and members is very important. So you're not going to stop all fraud, but the more you can do to help consumers resolve fraud, I think really helps with that experience and the empowerment. So thanks, Paige.
Awesome, Tracy. Let me see if do we have any questions from the group? Please enter questions in the box if you have questions. Otherwise, let's take a poll from our audience. So with the rise in fraud and scams brought on by the pandemic, do you expect to see another increase in fraud and scams in 2022? Yes or no, audience? And we'll give the audience about a minute. And while we're waiting, Tracy, I'm curious, did any of the research uncover how many hours an individual would spend resolving fraud on their own?
Yeah, we do have some of that research that shows, the consumers could spend anywhere. I mean, it depends on how much the fraud losses were. But I just was looking at some new research that came in that said, on average, they were spending, anywhere from 13 to 24 hours kind of resolving a fraud issue. But again, it doesn't really matter how much time they spend, Paige. I mean, if they are resolving the fraud on their own and they reach out to a financial institution or some other provider and they don't feel like they're getting resolution, that leaves a poor experience for the customer. And one thing that I will kind of note here, I know you and I've spoken about this before, we never really see any kind of fraud tactic or scam go away. We never see the old things go away, right? Like these kind of face-to-face tactics that fraudsters use to scam victims. Those never go away, but we just see new kinds of scams emerge. So I'll be curious to see what the audience take is here.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Do we have a response?
100%.
100%. Okay, not terribly surprising.
All right.
There. Let's see. If no questions, then we will. Thank you, Tracy. We will pass it to Greg.
Okay, thanks, Paige. Thanks, Tracy. First of all, just sound check. Can you hear me okay? Maybe Paige or Tracy,
Yep.
if you can weigh in. Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, first of all, Tracy, great data, great research. Just shameless plug for you and your company. We rely on your guys' reports and research all the time. So big fan. This is another report that we'll take into our product team here at MasterCard. And look, I'm going to take a little bit different angle for everyone on the call. I think Tracy did a great job of just kind of painting the picture of the risks that we face as financial institutions, even as consumers, when it comes to these scams and identity theft, et cetera. That's certainly a good reason and something that's top of mind for financial institutions, whether it be our card issuers, brands such as MasterCard or other brands that are out there, certainly the other major brands, Amex, Discover, Visa, the contact we have with them. Absolutely, this is a reason to start looking at solutions that provide education, even protection against scams and identity theft. But I'm going to instead focus on, in this presentation, more positive reasons why this is something to focus on as an industry. And simply said, it's good for business. And that's really what we've realized over the past few years here at MasterCard. And I've noticed that the financial institutions that we work with, as well as the other brands, like I mentioned, everyone has kind of picked up on this. There's two sides of this coin. There's a reactionary, hey, we need to do this, or else something bad will happen. But also, hey, let's do this because it's good for our business itself. So that's why I put together, first of all, just kind of a landscape slide where we will begin. So I'm going to start with kind of an overview on the current card payments landscape. what we're observing in consumer behavior when spending, when they're spending digitally. And just to say up front, what I mean by that, digital spend could be a lot of things. It could be e-commerce or shopping online as a guest checkout. It could be a card on file where you're storing your card with Netflix or Amazon or someone like that. It even extends to devices. Today, it's things like your smartphone, your iPads, etc. Tomorrow, it'll be, at least for most of us, appliances, things of that sort. Some of you on the call may have already started adopting even that Internet of Things household. But for the most part, what I'm going to talk about when I say digital spend, I'm talking about card on file, guest checkout, your typical online e-com spend. So I'm going to start there, and then second, I'm going to spend a little time talking about consumer attitudes. So we've conducted some market research ourselves. We've gone into our own data warehouse, and I'll just pull out some things I think are worthy to talk about what we're observing in regards to consumer attitudes. And then third, I'm just going to bring and highlight some additional data on fraud trends that a company within MasterCard called New Data produced based on some of the observances they've had with fraud attacks in the first half of this year. And then finally, I'll close out by just kind of giving an overview of what's going on amongst the four major brands in regards to identity theft protection. So still on this same slide, we're going to tackle kind of current payment landscape. So I think as Tracy mentioned, I think we're all aware of the accelerated shift of spend out of traditional card present or face-to-face, brick and mortar. There's different terms, but actually going to a store, going into a restaurant and paying for your goods or services, handing a card over to an individual, swiping it, dipping it, tapping it, that kind of thing. But COVID came along, like Tracy said, and this was already happening. Spend was already shifting into digital, but obviously COVID forced a lot of people who were reluctant to do so. They really had no other choice. They had to start finding ways to get the goods and services that they used to get at a store. They had to find a way to get that online. So that has been a huge momentum driver for just digital spend overall. And consumers are demonstrating that when they create these relationships with, I'll just say, a merchant, they've shown that they prefer to commit that spend to their primary card. So most of us as consumers have multiple cards in our purse or wallet, but most of us also typically have a preferred card, one that we use more often than the others. And in the online space, that has come to light that a preponderance of consumers out there, when they want to put a card on file with a merchant, they typically want to use their primary card. And these relationships are important because once this payment selection has been made by the consumer, the spend is virtually locked in. And the mindset is, maybe it's said another way, has become a set it and forget it. So think about Amazon. I think most of us have probably used the Amazon application, have bought some good or service over the past 18 months with them. And when you find the good or service that you need, you just swipe right. You no longer have to go in and find a card, much less enter a card. If you have a card on file, it's very easy. It's very convenient. But for the financial institutions, the banks, the card issuers, obviously the brands as well, this creates a new paradigm, because if you haven't created a number of reasons ahead of time with those consumers for why they should use your brand when it comes to the digital spend, then you're really presenting some risk. You may lose that spend and be locked out from that spend if they just happen that day to feel better about another brand, or just it's the first card that they pulled out of their wallet and they type that one in as the default. So it's becoming more and more important in digital to really put an emphasis on what can we do to create brand preference so that my brand is the preferred brand for all digital spend. So that's just kind of the mindset that we're starting to see in the financial industry overall. And it's because of these consumer attitudes that I'm referring to, the kind of set it and forget it. The other thing that's interesting in the data, it's showing that brand preference is really good for business. I think this is probably self-evident, but the data is showing that with each additional card on file relationship, so maybe you don't have a relationship at all today, you've just sat on the sidelines before COVID, and now you're forced to jump in and create a relationship with, I don't know, Netflix or Disney Plus or Amazon or whomever. The average spend for each additional COF relationship increases about 26%. So that's a huge increase, which obviously leads to top line revenue and bottom line profitability as well. So just one of those important call outs for why do we view this as good for business? The other reason is this spend is very sticky. So there's not a lot of churn by consumers once they establish a default form of payment with a merchant. Something really has to go terribly wrong for them to go in and make that change. And I think all of us as consumers, when we put our consumer hat on, I think we can all relate to that. We all have very busy lives. So having to go in and swap out card A for card B, you got to have a good reason for it. Now that could be the other guy messed up or messed up once too often, or the other reason would be there's just an incredibly attractive offer, which is expensive to put in front of consumers. So they don't happen all the time. So more often than not, what we're seeing is that churn really only happens, first of all, it's rare, but when it happens, it's typically due to some kind of frustration that has hit the consumer. Okay, so Brittany, let's move to the next slide, please. Because now we're gonna start moving into kind of consumer attitudes when shopping digitally. So before I go into anything here, think for a moment what is asked of a consumer when shopping online. So unlike when they walk into a store where all they have to exchange with that merchant is their card, in digital, they have to still hand over a form of payment, but they have to hand over so much more information to complete that transaction. Even if they're doing guest checkout, you see some of the data that's here. I mean, you have to hand over your name, your email, phone number, address, etc. And as Tracy called out, some of that information is becoming very, very attractive, much more attractive for criminals, and it's becoming much more profitable. So that is just important to understand, and it's something that I think we as a brand and something financial institutions have kind of woken up to is, consumers are really recognizing I have to have a lot more of my personal information involved just to get, I don't know, a ream of paper towels or something like that. Much more than when I ran into a Walmart or a Target where all I ever had to give someone was my card. And this is, I think, important, especially for the brands, because decades ago, the shift from cash and check over to card payments, the foundation of that movement was built on trust. That's a major driver for why all of us as consumers feel very comfortable walking around and giving our card to virtually any merchant, anyone, anywhere in the world. And the underlying strength of that trust is being supported by the zero liability policies that are out there. So if any financial harm occurs on this card, no worries, I'll have the funds restored to my account. Makes us all very, very comfortable. You shift over into card not present, e-commerce, online spend. Getting back to that other data, consumers have become hyper aware of the risks, and I'll move into this in the next few slides. But they're becoming more aware of the risks that they face if their personal information that's also involved in this type of spend falls into the wrong hands. And they're starting to ask questions, how is that protected? What are you doing as my financial institution to protect me? Just as you've always protected me in the past for when I was making face-to-face activity, what are you doing now when I have to make these same purchases online? So Brittany, let's move to the next slide and we'll go into some of the consumer attitudes. Okay, so this is getting into some research that we performed just as within MasterCard. And looking at polling consumers and asking them, well, what's preventing you, if you are a consumer who has not yet created a COF relationship, and this includes people who may be shopping online and just preferring to do a guest checkout. The top of the list, the major barrier is security. And if you look at, hopefully you can see that, hopefully the font's not too small for you. Within the realm of security, the number one concern is identity theft. Globally, it's 59% of consumers are coming back and saying, this is a barrier for me. I'm really concerned about storing my payment card with anyone because I'm aware of the risks of identity theft. And if you look to the right in the US, it's even higher. It shoots up to 68%. So US consumers in particular are even more sensitive to these concerns, these risks, than consumers globally. But overall, it's a very significant concern. And this is, if you can see, this is a concern stacked up against things that are outside of security. So it's being measured against concerns overall, not just in the world or universe of security concerns. So let's go to the next slide as well. So the next bit of research that I think was compelling that I wanted to share was consumers want identity theft protection. So we work in my group, my product team, we don't actually build the card products. We have another entire separate product division that actually defines what goes into a consumer debit card or credit card or a gold or platinum card, what benefits are tied in with that card. So working with them, we constantly do consumer research to say, well, what benefits do you want? And what's come to the top of the list, as you see here, is identity theft. And if you look at this entire list, this is a benefit stacked up against, once again, other benefits that have nothing to do with security. Some of them, like I'm looking at the list here: travel rewards, travel insurance, price protection, free stay at a hotel. None of these could beat out the security protection. So consumers, and some of these, when you see them stacked up, it's a sizable separation for how they measure and value identity theft protection versus some of the others that are on screen here. So consumers are not only aware of the risks that are out there, they're actively starting to demand that these protections be given to them to address those concerns. Okay, so let's move into the next slide, Brittany. So here, like I said, Tracy called out some excellent data in her presentation. This was one that I thought would highlight why their concerns are valid. So I mentioned that MasterCard, a few years ago, we acquired a company called NuData. And for those who are not familiar with that company and what they do, the simplest way I could describe their services, they offer passive authentication of consumers when they log into their accounts, whether that be online banking, a merchant, etc. And passive authentication, to drill into that a little deeper, are things like recognizing how you hold your phone when you're logging in, the way you move your mouse on screen, the cadence at which you type in your username and password. These are things that are fingerprints or signatures that help identify why Tracy is different from an imposter who happens to have Tracy's login information. They can actively detect that, yes, the login credentials are correct, but it's not the real Tracy because of maybe it's the cadence at which you typed it in. Tracy probably has repeatedly typed that in, and so her cadence is maybe far faster than a criminal who's trying to type that in, or a bot maybe typing it in too fast. So those are things that NuData offers to its customers out there. So they're embedded in a lot of different online applications, online portals, and they're trying to detect and prevent imposters or the wrong individual from accessing your account. And with the data that they harvested in the first half of this year, what I want to call out on this screen is they've noticed a significant increase in the number of attacks using correct login credentials. So it's always been around 2% over the past couple of years, but really in the first half of this year, they saw it shoot up to almost 10% of the attacks that are happening are using valid login credentials. And that's really important because, one, it's shown that criminals, are either these credentials are more readily available, or it indicates that this form of attack is more profitable than maybe it has been in the past for them. Either way, it presents a very valid risk, a more valid risk lately than it used to in the past for consumers when thinking about, hey, if my information falls into the wrong hands, what harm may come to me, and how likely is it that harm may come to me? And the data that we're seeing is showing that yes, this is a form of attack, an account takeover attack that is more likely these days than it used to be. Okay, so then finishing up on the last slide. Okay, so I'm sure everyone is aware of, or I'm not sure, I guess I should say, that if everyone on the call is aware of what offers exist out there for identity theft protection. So I just really, as for your own personal benefit, because I think all of us probably have a card or two in our wallet or purse, and I just wanted to highlight that identity theft, I mentioned earlier, is something that has become a product or service that the brands and financial institutions are aware of all the research that I just covered, that the risks that are out there, the benefits, why it's good for business, and they're starting to make some significant investment in offering identity theft protection as a card level benefit. So in other words, it's a service that is offered free of charge to varying degrees, depending on the brand and the card product you have. It's worth going out there to your card issuer's website or your bank's website. They may be promoting it well, but if you have a Discover, Amex, Visa, MasterCard, go to the brand portals and you'll find the information. I've listed some of it here. MasterCard in the US, shameless plug for our company, but our core product has stepped up and they've made an investment. They're offering identity theft protection for any MasterCard card, no matter the card product type. You get a full comprehensive level of protections, and it's free. So it saves you quite a bit of money, hundreds of dollars a year, if you were to go buy the same level of protection out there. So I say, go after it and sign up. But if you have another brand, look, Visa's out there, Discover, Amex, they're offering protections as well. Go out and do research and do comparisons. See how if you have a credit card versus a debit card, shop around and see what financial institutions are offering or what the brands are offering, and you may find a good reason to switch if you want to start more proactively protecting your data that's out there, given the risks that we're talking about on this call. So there, I'll end there. Paige, I'll turn it back over to you, and we can open it up for questions.
Thanks, Greg. Before we move on to any questions for Greg, let's take another poll from our audience. So what fraud prevention resources do you already provide to your customers, if any? We have another minute there. Greg, just thinking about your last slide, it's interesting that the 4 major credit card companies all offer some type of identity theft protection services. Do you think this will be a trend for other major institutions beyond financial institutions or credit card providers?
Yeah, I think so. For the reasons Tracy stated, and just the risks. Look, I think we're somewhat speculating here, guys. So don't take this as gospel. But it would not surprise us if financial institutions are start to become held liable for scams. It's not something that they're facing today, but just like when there's fraud on a credit card, for example, someone has to cover that expense. Obviously, the consumer is not, but there's different rules. I don't need to get into all the chargeback rights and who has to eat that fraud loss, but someone is absorbing that loss when there's fraud, and it might become the same thing for financial institutions when it comes to identity theft and scams. So that's obviously a big incentive to start offering it. And then obviously, like I shared earlier, if you can create separation from your competition, that's always a good thing. And identity theft it's starting to become apparent that if you can provide that peace of mind to your customer base and say, look, partner with us, because if you do, we're going to be there with you. We're going to help proactively monitor this valuable information. And probably better still, if any of it does fall in the wrong hands, we'll be there to help fix it and repair it. That can be a way to attract new relationships, drive more business, and also retain the relationships that you already have. So,
yeah, and Paige,
Yep.
if I could just piggyback on that just quickly.
Sure.
You know, one of the things that Greg said, I think makes a couple of things. Yes, definitely think we need to start thinking ahead about institutions being held liable for scams. In fact, we already see that, you know, in other parts of the world, thinking of, you know, Great Britain specifically. But the other thing, I think it's very promising to see that so many organizations are offering educational content and resources. And I think the identity protection services kind of falls in line with that, as well as, you know, kind of a fraud resolution service. So I think all of this is a good sign. And I'm hopeful that next year, if we were to conduct a similar poll, you know, we would see that bar on top a little bit longer and more IDPS being offered, just as part of a service that you provide to customers.
Yeah, and hopefully a little bit less on the bottom there. I'm surprised it's still, you know, around 36% with nothing.
Right.
So yeah, I agree. Any other observations from the panel there? Okay, let me see if we've got any questions for Greg, and then we will, nothing right now, so we'll move on to Arturo. Take it away, Arturo.
Great. It's a pleasure to meet you all virtually. So I wear two hats. I'm the Senior Vice President and lead for cyber insurance at Hub International, but I also am a teacher. So what you see behind me is my book rack just for my classes. So I teach at the University of California, Berkeley. So I'm going to switch hats. Right now we'll start on the Berkeley side. So you're looking at a slide with two examples of a brand insult. So if you were my students, I'd start by asking you, what's the difference between a brand and a reputation? And since you can't answer me, I'm going to tell you that very few companies have a brand. Most companies have a reputation. And here's a good example of the kinds of reputations you don't want to have. But what would be an example of a company with a real brand? Well, this is a Peet's cup of coffee, so it has a very strong brand in the area because Starbucks was born out of Peet's. But in their case, in your example, you would imagine a Starbucks example. And so if you have a cup of coffee, it costs, what, 25 cents to make, you might sell it for $2. But if you put it in a white cup with a green label, it's now a $5 cup of coffee. So the same thing happens with iPhones. The same thing happens with Coca-Cola. I mean, really, what is Coca-Cola? It's brown sugar water. You can sell it for more than gasoline. So that's the miracle of a brand. Those are companies that really have brands. So the brand is a promise. The reason that you go to McDonald's to get French fries is because French fries is going to be perfect every time because they control the supply chain from the potatoes all the way to the consumer's mouth. So you don't want to mess with that brand because that's the miracle. You can make a lot of money if you have a really good brand, and you can really tarnish it if you're a financial institution. I will just mention Wells Fargo is a good example of somebody that I don't know anybody that would bank with anymore because of the way they tarnish their brand, and that's with a kind of cataclysmic series of fines. But you can also do it by little nickeling, diming people to death. So my current bank, I'm leaving. It's been my bank since I was 7 years old. It was called NCNB back then. You might know who I'm talking about, but it's a very large bank. And because they just constantly are making life difficult, and there's easier banks to work with. So here, what we're looking at on the left is Target. So this is 2014. Target lost 41 million records. And what you're looking at is their most important quarter of all year. So retailers, depending on the kind of retail organization you have, as much as 50% of the year is done between Thanksgiving and Christmas. That's true of Target. Target saw a 44% drop because nobody wanted to do business with them after that breach. Over on the right, you're looking at something that's rarer, which is one insult, no company left anymore. That would be Enron. So the brand promise of Enron was rocket science accounting, and when they showed that they had to restate earnings and they basically were fraudsters, that was the end of Enron. $72 billion of market capitalization disappeared in basically a couple of weeks, and it took Arthur Andersen with it. So what would be examples of single point failures? Perrier, they let benzene get into the water, and the only reason you were buying Perrier water is because it was healthy. So nobody buys Perrier water anymore. Recently in the news, you saw Aussie Media. Aussie Media's just went out single point failure because of one report in the New York Times. So that's because of a kind of fraudulent call they made in Goldman Sachs. All right, so let's turn to the next slide. So in insurance and in risk, there's risks that you retain, there's risks that you try to reduce, there's risks that you can transfer with an insurance product or with a contract, and there's risks you have to avoid. So in the retained section, most consumers are retaining their identity theft risks. They don't buy on their own, they don't buy any products. Very few of them are doing anything to mitigate the fact that they could have identity theft. They reuse passwords, they don't lock their credit, etc. So overall on the right, a savvy consumer would actually try to reduce their losses, so mitigating some of the problem that they have. So they would lock that credit report. For one, they would buy a lockbox on their mail. This is Oakland back behind me, and our mailboxes are constantly being hit by people who are trying to get checks and information to do identity theft. So everybody here has a locked mailbox. So that would be a harm reduction step that you have. Over on the left, you have transfer. So there are insurance products that can help with this. Credit monitoring would be down in the reduce, because credit monitoring just tells you that the horse is about to leave the barn. Some of these credit monitoring solutions actually have an insurance product attached to it, so that there's a loss, the insurance would cover it. And then over here on the right is you just have to avoid it. I mean, really, you can't afford to have things like that happen to you at Target. The losses were enormous. I mentioned the losses just to revenue, but the total loss for them was $292 million in terms of just the restoration of the network. So that they only had $100 million in insurance, so they were out of the money. $192 million. To mention another one, Home Depot, that was a $289 million loss. They had $100 million of insurance, so they were out of the money, $189 million. And then it was Anthem, it lost 78 million records, and that cost $391.5 million. And they only had $100 million in limits, so they were out of the money, $291 million. So why do they all have $100 million in limits? Because most buyers of insurance ask for benchmarking, which is how lemmings pick suicide vests. I mean, the incidence curves, as you were seeing from Greg, the incidence curves that you're seeing there's a rapid increase in these risks. And so if you're looking backwards or to how people are driving to the right or left of you instead of looking forward, you're just going to shipwreck. And that was an example of what happened. Let's go to the next slide. So the way you do risk management is, this is what I call the risk management stack. So let's start with avoidance strategy, and let's use an analogy really quickly. So in your office, the avoidance strategy is that nobody's allowed to bring in flammable liquids. Prevention strategy would be the walls are made out of fire-resistant firewall, and there's things in the wall so that the fire can't go up between the walls. Mitigation would be the sprinklers, the fire extinguisher in the hallway. Transfer would be the lease, as well as the insurance product. So in terms of cyber insurance, the things that you would need to do to avoid losses is small merchants should be using a payment vendor. They're not good at maintaining credit cards, and so they use a payment vendor. Problem is, the payment vendor just moves the operational risk, does not move the legal risks. So they're still going to be held accountable by PCI, the PCI industry. So they have to have an insurance product, which is at the bottom. So we'll get to that. What would be a prevention strategy? Well, they definitely need to coordinate with their incident response vendors for the insurance product, and they should have the tires kicked on the security of their company. If you're a consumer, you should file your taxes early so that fraudsters can't get in ahead of you. Transfer, let's go to transfer. Transfer is done with contracts. I'm going to give you a warning about this. A typical cyber insurance product will cover the insured if they're using some kind of a vendor. If that vendor breaches the privacy of the company that's hired them, the insurance product will protect the insured. The insurance product says there has to be a direct contract between you and the contractor. So it does not extend to a typical 3-tier SaaS architecture. So if there's a subcontractor, let's say it's Amazon or Azure, that's hosting the SaaS provider, they're not in contractual privity with the insured anymore, and we're seeing denials. So we already had a bank that got denied because they were using a BI tool that was sitting on on top of Amazon. Amazon breached the data. The bank had to notify everybody, and then they turned to their insurer, and insurer says you're not in contractual privity with Amazon, so tough luck. So there are a lot of things we have to deal with here on the insurance side of it when I'm wearing my hub hat. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's happened is that actually privacy breaches are down right now, 30%, because criminals have figured out a better way to make money, which is ransomware attacks. So ransomware is up a lot. So just to give, Greg was giving you examples of account takeover. We're seeing it all the way down to SMS texting, right? So smishing is up 300%. Ransomware is up 315%. Now you'll see a lot of strange numbers about that, but there's a company called Chain Analysis that actually follows the blockchain, so they can actually see the money being moved. So that's a better number. So that's a real number. Last year was 315%. So far in the first 7 or 8 months of this, we've already seen 315% increase. So it's a bad situation. The result is the insurers are losing money. They're not profitable anymore. So they're no longer just taking any insurer. They're demanding that there be really strong controls in place. So here's the must-have slide right now. You have to have multi-factor authentication everywhere. Email filtering. So there's a number of protocols, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, it has to be used. Backups, there has to be backups that are offline, air-gapped, or you have to be using some kind of a cloud vendor that can handle ransomware attacks. Endpoint protection. They really are looking for advanced tools, and are looking for tools from 4 to 5 companies. And if you're not a name brand endpoint detection system, you don't get insured anymore. End of life. They are intolerant of anybody having an XP machine, a Win 7 machine. Any of that stuff is just, if it exists in a network, you don't get insured anymore. Testing. They don't want the test but verify. They want everybody to test for phishing. They want to test the backups. You're not testing, even though you're training, you don't get insured. Larger insureds really need to meet a zero trust architecture, which means that the administrative passwords are being locked up in a personal access management system, and nobody has system administrator privileges inside of the network, definitely not over the domain. They want to see an SIEM, which is a portal that looks over everything, and then they demand network segmentation. So if there's a breach, one place, it doesn't take out a whole flat WAN. Next slide, please. So this is just an example. I'm not going to read it to you. This is just from Beasley. That's the laundry list from Beasley. You don't have that, you're not insured. Next. So I mentioned that you have to have the filtering. I wanted to say you have to train, of course, but honestly, training people isn't enough for email, because you can get hit with a homograph attack. So you really have to have an AI filter. So a homograph attack is when you see Google, that's being turned by the machine into a series of codes, right? Well, there's a different code for an O that's a Roman O, an Attic Greek O, a Russian O. And so you could spell Google, you and I would see Google, but it wouldn't be the same Google because it's being done, say, with Cyrillic O's. And so people can't tell that. Only machines can tell that. So email filtering has to move up to AI. In fact, all the larger enterprises are shifting everything over to AI, because your weakest link really is wetware. People are the weakest link that you have. Next slide, please. All right, so Tracy mentioned that there's an awful lot of fraud going on. It's just right and left everywhere with regard to COVID. And so you really need to provide legitimate links to your employees for COVID, because if they go search, I have great slides where what you're looking at is the Johns Hopkins map. What you don't realize is that on top of that COVID incidence map is sitting a transparent layer. So if you click on the map, you actually get infected with a drive-by. So you need to have very strong filtering right at the firewall. And so your firewall really needs to be being fed a kill list from an IP kill list. It says these are known malicious sites. Only advanced firewalls can do that, or you put a box in front of the firewall that can do that. Not a lot of people are doing that, but that's the next step. Next slide, please. So if you look at the causes of loss for insurers right now at this moment in time, this comes from AXA XL, which is one of the big insurers. The business email compromise is 25% of their losses, and ransomware. If you look at Palo Alto Network's survey of ransomware, ransomware almost always has some point in time when there's a business email compromise. So
Hey, Paige, I'll just add something to that if you don't mind.
Yep.
While some questions are coming. There were tons of things, Arturo, that you said were fascinating, but I'm just going to hone in on one, and that is that, this remote workforce, like you kind of mentioned, I think Greg mentioned this too, that we can't predict the future, but I think we can anticipate things, right, based on what we've seen so far. And one of the shortcomings that I've seen in some of the research we've done is that from 2020 to 2021, some of the investments in network intrusion and endpoint security dropped. And I think part of that was because that a lot of IT teams and maybe even cyber teams anticipated that the workforce wasn't going to continue to be so remote, right? And so I think we have to be very mindful not to be short-sighted about those types of things. Again, going back to the world is forever changed, and we have to keep that in mind. So I think that last slide you showed kind of illustrates that as well.
So the one thing that you're seeing is there's kind of it accelerated certain trends, right? So in the old days, the way you protected a corporate network is it was kind of like the feudal system. You built a big castle, you put a moat around it, and you tried to protect the interior of it. That's not how. If you've ever been to Rome or Istanbul, you can see the old wall is sitting in the middle of the city. I mean, the cities just had to outgrow that, which is what's happened to the corporate network. The corporate network has all kinds of vendors coming in and doing things at the same time. So it's like a modern city. So the only way you can work there is you have to have like a modern police force, and that's called a zero trust architecture. So you can go read about it on the government has a number of good white papers on it, NIST, as well as Microsoft has very good papers on it. But the insurers are looking for people to migrate towards that zero trust. And one of the things about zero trust is on authentication. That's why the MFA. So Tracy mentioned that emails are valuable. Actually, what's killing everybody is the fact that people reuse passwords. So there's millions upon millions of passwords that are in the public domain, because even though they were encrypted, you can run a rainbow table attack against them, figure out what the hash was, and publish it. So one thing I'd recommend to everybody on this call is to kind of open up your eyes, go to a website called Have I Been Pwned? Have I Been Pwned? And pwned doesn't have an O in it. It's PWNED. And you enter any email, like your boss's email, it'll tell you how many times he's been owned by hackers. Because, I mean, Yahoo alone lost 1 billion passwords. So anyway, password managers are really important. Very few people are using them. A good example of failure to kind of prevent a problem.
Great, good, lively discussion. We have time for one quick question that was asked of Tracy, and I'm just gonna ask that question. So what are your thoughts on engaging and empowering consumers to prevent fraud scams, not just report and resolve them?
Well, I think a lot of that goes back to education. I think it was promising that we saw that slide where, a lot of the organizations on the call here today are actually investing in education. So as you see emerging scams in the marketplace, ensuring that you're educating consumers about that. And again, the education has to be somewhat targeted, because the types of scams that are going to hit older generations aren't going to be the same that hit younger generations. But on top of that, financial services, in addition to identity protection, needs to be looking at, technologies to invest in that also help to detect the scams on their ends, because we can't rely solely on education and on the consumer. And Greg mentioned this too, the industry has to take some accountability and responsibility there too. So I think there's a technical piece to it, but also if we're talking about empowerment, there's an educational piece to it as well. Hopefully.
Absolutely. Yes, and we're just about out of time. And before we close, I would like to thank our speakers again for their participation and sharing terrific info and resources around this topic. And thanks to all of you in the audience for taking your time to join us today. If you have questions that we didn't have time for, please send us an email at irismarketing@irisidentityprotection.com. And be sure to follow us on social media. We can be found on Facebook and Twitter by the handle @IrisIDProtect, and on LinkedIn by our company page titled Generali Global Assistant, Cyber and Identity Protection. We're always sharing the most recent news and resources as it relates to cyber and identity protection, so be sure to follow us for those updates. And don't forget to visit our website for educational content during Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Thank you all again for your time today, and we hope to see you at one of our next events.
Thank you.